There was a soldier who thought he understood war. His name was Corporal James Harlow, and he had served in 3 campaigns across 2 continents. He had fought in open fields where cannons roared and muskets cracked like thunder. He had stormed fortified cities and seen walls crumble under artillery fire. He knew tactics and formations, supply lines, and flanking maneuvers. He believed that war was a science, that superior technology and training always won. And then the Empire sent him to the forest, to fight an enemy that did not wear uniforms, that did not form battle lines, that did not fight like soldiers at all, an enemy that moved like shadows and killed like ghosts. Hunters, men who had tracked leopards through jungle undergrowth since they were children, who could read a broken twig like a book, who knew every plant, every animal, every sound the forest made, and who understood something that Corporal Harlow and his modern empire had forgotten, that the oldest tricks are often the deadliest. Within 3 months, Harlow's regiment of 800 men would be reduced to fewer than 200, not by bullets or bayonets, but by poison and patience, by false trails and animal calls, by an enemy that turned the forest itself into a weapon. This is the story of how an army of hunters outsmarted a modern empire with ancient tricks. And it begins with a lesson that empires always learn too late. Technology does not matter if you are fighting on someone else's land. Do you know what it is like to walk through a forest that is trying to kill you? Where every step could trigger a trap, where every shadow could hide an enemy, where the very air feels hostile, alive, waiting? The Imperial soldiers thought they were marching into a routine pacification mission. The Empire had claimed this territory, drawn it on their maps in bold ink, and declared it part of their colonial holdings. But the people who lived there, the forest tribes, did not recognize maps drawn by men who had never set foot in their land. They did not bow to flags planted by strangers. And when the Empire sent soldiers to force their submission, the tribes did not field an army. They did what they had always done. They hunted. And this time, the prey wore red coats and carried muskets. The tribes were not a unified nation. They were dozens of clans scattered across hundreds of miles of dense forest. They spoke different dialects, followed different customs, had different traditions. But they shared one thing: knowledge. Knowledge of the land that had been passed down through generations. How to move silently through undergrowth. How to identify poisonous plants and extract their toxins. How to read animal behavior and predict weather patterns. How to survive in a place that killed outsiders within days. The Empire saw them as primitive, savages with bows and spears who would scatter at the first volley of musket fire. But the tribes saw the Empire for what it was: invaders who did not belong, who did not understand where they were, who were already dead, they just did not know it yet. The Imperial force that entered the forest numbered 800 men, infantry with muskets and bayonets, officers on horseback, supply wagons carrying ammunition, food, and medicine. They marched in formation, following what their maps told them was a trail leading to the largest tribal settlement. They planned to arrive, demand surrender, and establish a garrison. A simple operation that should take a week, maybe 2. But the trail they were following was not a real trail. It was a false path, carefully maintained by the tribes to lead invaders exactly where they wanted them: deep into the forest, far from any escape route, into the killing ground. The first deaths came on the 3rd day. A private named Thomas fell behind the column to relieve himself. His comrades heard him scream. By the time they reached him, he was on the ground, convulsing, foam pouring from his mouth, dead within minutes. The regiment's doctor examined the body and found a tiny puncture wound on his leg. A thorn, the doctor said, but not a natural thorn. This one had been dipped in poison. The soldiers looked around nervously. The forest suddenly felt different. Less like terrain to march through and more like something watching them. The colonel ordered the men to stay in formation, to not wander off. But the damage was done. Fear had entered the camp. And fear is poison too. Over the next week, more men died. Not in battles. In 1s and 2s. A soldier would step on what looked like solid ground and fall into a pit lined with sharpened stakes coated in toxin. Another would brush against a vine that left his skin burning and blistering. Another would drink from a stream and collapse hours later, his insides destroyed by contamination the tribes had introduced upstream. The The hunters never showed themselves. The soldiers never saw an enemy to fight. Just death, random and invisible, picking them off one by one. Corporal Harlow started checking everything. The ground before he stepped. The plants before he touched them. The water before he drank. But it was not enough. Because the forest had 1,000 ways to kill, and the tribes knew all of them. Then came the animal calls. At night, when the soldiers made camp, they heard sounds from the forest. Birdsong, monkey howls, the roar of predators. Normal sounds, the officers said. Just the forest at night. But Corporal Harlow noticed something. The calls had patterns. They repeated in sequences that did not quite sound natural. And they seemed to move, circling the camp, getting closer, and then fading away. He realized the truth before most of his comrades did. Those were not animals. Those were the hunters. Communicating, coordinating, surrounding them. And the soldiers, trapped in their camp with their muskets and their drills and their belief in superiority, could do nothing but listen and wait for whatever came next. What came next was the night attacks. Not charges or assaults. Just arrows. Silent, precise, deadly. They came from the darkness beyond the firelight, striking sentries before they could shout a warning. By the time soldiers grabbed their muskets and fired into the trees, the hunters were already gone, melted back into shadows. The musket volleys hit nothing but leaves and bark. And the noise, the thunderous crack of dozens of muskets firing at once, it just told the hunters exactly where the soldiers were, gave them new targets. The tribes were not afraid of guns. Guns were loud and slow. By the time a soldier reloaded, a hunter could fire 3 arrows. And the arrows were silent. Arrows did not give away your position. Arrows had been killing men for thousands of years, and they still worked. The colonel decided to abandon the mission and retreat. But when the soldiers tried to retrace their steps, they found the trail had changed. Paths they remembered were gone, blocked by fallen trees and thick undergrowth. New paths had appeared, leading in directions that felt wrong. The tribes had been reshaping the forest around them, guiding them deeper and deeper into terrain that favored ambush. The soldiers tried to use compasses, but the dense canopy made it hard to see the sun. They tried to follow streams, but the waterways split and rejoined in confusing patterns. And all the while, the hunters watched, waited, struck when opportunities appeared. Another man died from a poison dart. Another fell into a hidden pit. Another dragged away in the night, his screams cut short. Corporal Harlow watched his regiment fall apart, not in one catastrophic battle, but in slow erosion. Men deserted, convinced they would have better chances on their own in the forest. They were wrong. Their bodies were found days later, if they were found at all. Others went mad from the stress, from the constant fear, from the knowledge that they were being hunted by an enemy they could not see or fight. The officers tried to maintain discipline. But how do you discipline men who are facing death from invisible sources? How do you court-martial a soldier for refusing to march when every step could be his last? The modern army, with all its training and technology, was being destroyed by tactics that were older than gunpowder. Traps and poisons, ambushes and misdirection. The fundamental tools of hunters who had perfected their craft over centuries. One night, Harlow was on watch when he heard footsteps, not trying to be silent. Someone walking openly toward the camp. He raised his musket, called out a challenge. A figure emerged from the darkness. A young man, barely 20, wearing simple cloth and carrying a bow. One of the hunters. He stopped at the edge of the firelight and spoke in broken colonial language. He said the tribes had a message for the soldiers. Leave. Go back to your ships. This land is not yours. You do not belong here. If you stay, you will all die. Not in battle, but slowly, one by one, until none of you remain. Then he turned and walked back into the forest. Harlow did not fire. He could have, should have, according to military protocol. But he did not, because he knew the young hunter was right. They were not going to win this. They were not even fighting a war. They were just dying in a forest that did not want them. The colonel refused to retreat. He said it would be cowardly, that the empire did not bow to threats from primitives. He ordered the men to push forward, to find the tribal settlement and destroy it. But the settlement did not exist. Or rather, it existed in a dozen places, temporary camps that the tribes could pack up and move in hours. The soldiers were chasing ghosts, wasting energy and supplies on a target that was never where they expected it to be. Meanwhile, the hunters continued their work. They poisoned the regiment's water supplies. They stole food from the supply wagons, leaving the soldiers hungry and weak. They set fires in the forest to drive the soldiers into areas where ambushes waited. And they used sound, drums in the night, whistles that sounded like screams, mimicking the voices of dead soldiers to unnerve the living. Psychological warfare that was just as effective as any poison. After 2 months in the forest, the regiment had lost half its men. The survivors were sick, starving, and broken. The colonel was killed by an arrow that came from nowhere while he was relieving himself behind a tree. The remaining officers held a council and made the decision the colonel had refused to make. They would retreat. They would abandon the mission and return to the coast. It took them 3 weeks to find their way out of the forest. 3 weeks of continued attacks, continued deaths, continued fear. But the hunters let them go, not out of mercy, but because they had made their point. The Empire could send its soldiers, its guns, its flags. But the forest belonged to the tribes, and anyone who forgot that would pay the price. Of the 800 soldiers who had entered the forest, fewer than 200 made it back to the coast. And those who survived were not the same. They were haunted, broken. Corporal Harlow was among them. He returned to the Empire and resigned from the army. He could not explain to his superiors what had happened. How do you tell generals who have studied European warfare that you were defeated by men with bows and poison? That all your training meant nothing against an enemy who refused to fight by your rules? News of the defeat spread slowly at first. The Empire tried to suppress it, tried to call it a strategic withdrawal, a temporary setback. But soldiers talk, and the story of the Forest Campaign spread to other colonies, other territories where indigenous people were resisting imperial expansion. And they learned, they studied, they adapted the tactics to their own lands. In deserts, tribes used sandstorms and false oases to lure imperial patrols to their deaths. In mountains, guerrillas used rock slides and narrow passes. In swamps, resistance fighters used disease and ambush. The tribes had proven something that inspired resistance movements across 2 continents. You do not need modern weapons to win. You need knowledge. You need patience. You need to understand your land better than your enemy does. And you need to be willing to fight a different kind of war. Not battles, but attrition. Not glory, but survival. The Empire eventually abandoned its claims to the forest territory. They declared it worthless, not worth the cost. But the truth was simpler. They had been beaten, outsmarted, humiliated by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. And that defeat, more than any grand battle, damaged the Empire's reputation. Other colonies saw that resistance was possible, that the Empire could bleed, that technology was not invincible. Within a generation, independence movements would rise across the Empire's holdings. Many of them used tactics inspired by the Forest Campaign: guerrilla warfare, ambush, poison, false trails, the ancient tricks that had proven deadlier than cannons. Corporal Harlow lived the rest of his life in a small village far from any forest. He never spoke about what had happened unless he was drunk. And when he did talk, he said the same thing every time. We thought we were hunting them. But from the moment we entered that forest, they were hunting us. We were the prey. We just did not know it. He died young, his body worn out from tropical diseases he had contracted during the campaign. But before he died, he wrote a letter. Not to his family, to the young hunter who had walked into the camp that night and delivered the warning. He did not know if the letter would ever reach him, did not even know the hunter's name. But he wrote it anyway. And he said, "You were right. We did not belong there. I am sorry we came. I am sorry for the men I helped kill. And I am sorry we did not listen when you told us to leave." The letter was never sent. It was found among his belongings after his death. But the sentiment was real. The acknowledgement that the tribes had been defending their home, and that the Empire had been the invader. The tribes still live in the forest. They never signed treaties with the Empire, never acknowledged its authority. They simply continued to exist, as they had for thousands of years. The forest remains theirs, and the trails through it, the real ones that locals use safely, are still maintained. But there are also the false trails. Still there, still waiting, just in case another empire ever forgets the lesson. That some lands cannot be conquered, that some people cannot be subjugated, and that the oldest tricks, the ones that have been used since humans first learned to hunt, they still work. Still kill, still defending. Because technology changes, but the fundamentals of survival do not. Know your land, know your enemy, and never, ever fight on someone else's terms. This is the story of how an army of hunters outsmarted a modern empire with ancient tricks, of how bows beat muskets, how poison beats medicine, how patience beats technology. But it is also the story of 800 men who marched into a forest and learned too late that war is not always won by the side with better weapons. Sometimes it is won by the side that knows the terrain, that understands the environment, that has been fighting in that place since before empires existed. The tribes did not write history books, did not build monuments to their victory. They did not need to. The forest itself is their monument, a living reminder that some places belong to the people who have always lived there, and that anyone who forgets that will join the corpses buried beneath the roots and vines, where the forest slowly reclaims everything that does not belong. The empire fell eventually. Other empires rose and fell, but the tribes remain, still hunting, still surviving, still teaching their children the old tricks. The poison plants, the animal calls, the false trails, not because they want to fight, but because they know that someday, someone will always come. Someone will always believe that superior technology means victory. And when they do, the forest will be waiting, silent, patient, deadly, just like it always has been.